There's really very little difference between a brand like the Catholic Church and Apple. I was called a she-devil for my beliefs about branding. And then, in 2019, I get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the same people that criticized me.
In a brand strategy exercise, how would you approach that with a client?
If they were looking to reinvigorate their brand, I would ask them.
Today on DeepFeed, I interview design legend Debbie Millman. She has a robust career as a writer, designer, educator, brand consultant, and the host of the podcast Design Matters. Debbie has interviewed over 500 of the most creative people in the world over the past 19 years.
It's incredible to be in their worlds for the time that I'm doing the research and then get to ask them anything I want.
She worked on the logo and brand identity for Burger King, Hershey's, Haagen-Dazs, Tropicana, Star Wars, and the No More movement. In this episode, we discuss the role and definition of brand strategy.
Everything starts with the positioning.
Debbie's design process.
How are we going to view this brand in the marketplace, on shelf, in culture?
Her take on personal branding.
The moment you say that you're a brand, you're manufacturing your own meaning.
And much more. Let's get into it. You have said that branding is a result, not a journey, and that branding is defined by, quote, deliberate differentiation. What do you mean by that?
Well, brands don't really exist on their own. They are manufactured by people. And so what we're doing is meaning manufacture. And the way in which we understand brands is through consensus of belief. And so you create something, and that thing you then position and name and market. So that's the journey part. Once you have that consensus by a group of people or by a culture, then you create a brand. And that brand has all the meaning that you've developed on that journey. Brands don't grow on trees. You can turn a banana into a brand, but it doesn't start out as a brand.
Right.
And therefore, what we're doing when we're making brands, especially if it's in a category where there are other brands, is very deliberate differentiation. Otherwise, there's no reason for people to want or buy that thing. So if we look at all of the books and magazines here, they're all books and magazines. Mm-hmm. We understand that. Why would we want to buy one versus another? Why would we want to read one versus another? Each one, if successful, is differentiated from the other. And that's done in a very deliberate, intentional way. And so that's what I mean by deliberate differentiation.
On the topic of this differentiation, if we call it competitive differentiation, in a brand strategy exercise, how would you approach that with a client?
I would ask them why. That would be the first thing. And if they were looking to reinvigorate their brand, I would ask them not only why, but what's wrong? What's happening that you need to do this?
Right.
A reinvigoration of a brand will only work if you are communicating some advantage to reinvigorating the brand. If you're reinvigorating the brand and sort of glowing it up in an effort to attract more people without a reason for the glow up, then you're just getting people to try it, and they won't necessarily believe in it or buy into it literally unless it's something that is going to be lasting and enjoyable and, again, differentiated from something else. Now, you can have an attitudinal shift, but that takes a lot of money. If you want to keep Pepsi-Cola or Coca-Cola the same ingredients, but try to attract new people, chances are you're going to do that in a somewhat superficial way, which will only really last as long as the sort of coattails that you're riding stay in trend and popular. That's why they don't use Cindy Crawford anymore for their advertising. Not that she's not still as beautiful, but she's just not as relevant in that sort of trend field.
Yeah, on that note, like in a world where being values driven is critical for a brand, especially, I mean, for any brand, but especially startups, when they are doing the work to try to figure out their why and tell that story, how can a brand really approach genuine advocacy without coming off as opportunistic, you think?
Good question. They have to have real advocacy. They have to really believe it. They have to commit to it, whether it's popular or not. And a lot of brands think that they're advocating for something. And then if the consumer doesn't like it, they pull back. I mean, what Budweiser did was just horrific. You can't say you believe in something and then have any kind of public outcry that results in you pulling back. And it's shameful when brands do that because then it's apparent that it's opportunistic. Then it's
Yeah.
apparent that they only did this to appeal to a certain segment of the population. You have to commit to it and stick with it. Otherwise, it's going to be not only opportunistic, but duplicitous.
Yeah. Are there any brands that you've worked on or that you admire right now that you feel are doing a really good job of that?
Generally speaking, no.
Yeah.
Patagonia always sort of shows up, and that's the general sort of example. I do admire what Nike did with Colin Kaepernick.
Hmm.
I don't always admire their policies and their manufacturing, but I do admire what they did and what they're doing in supporting him. Because when that was first announced, some segment of the population were very outraged and took their Nike sneakers and tried to burn them or run them over with cars or trains and tried to rip them up, which was, it felt like cutting off their nose to spite their face. But a lot of people at that moment in time, particularly Wall Street, they were very nervous that Nike had impacted not only their market share, but their valuation. And what showed up several months later was a reward on Wall Street because their stock actually went up because of that.
Yeah.
So that was that's a good example of a non-opportunistic way in which they portrayed their advocacy. Nothing
Definitely.
upsets me more in June than seeing the rainbow washing of various companies
Yeah.
that feel that putting out a flag, a gay pride flag, is somehow going to help their perception in the marketplace. Whereas now, unless they're doing it 365, 24/7, it just looks ridiculous.
Yeah, I've actually heard of companies that have hired me to be on panels and talk about queerness and identity and then hearing about politics internally and how they're actually treating their employees inside and the conflict of that with how they want to be perceived versus how they're showing up. And it
Yeah.
is like very common to see that in the corporate world, that hypocrisy.
Absolutely. Every May, my wife and I both get all the invitations to come speak at different companies. Most of them want us to come together now because then they're getting the race and orientation card played. But you know what? We've decided that if we can make a difference, we want to.
Yeah. I am curious, how do you decide what clients to take on and say no to?
Well, I'm very, very, very fortunate in that I worked for close to 40 years in, I guess, corporate America. The last 20 plus at an agency that I ran. And now on my own since 2016, I very consciously decided that I'm not working with any for profit corporations unless they're doing work that I believe in. And so most of the work that I've been doing is in the space of nonprofits that are making a difference. So I worked for Lambda Legal and I worked on rebranding them, which was a joy. I do a lot of work for the Joyful Heart Foundation, which is about eradicating sexual violence in our culture. A lot of the work I do now is pro bono because I'm lucky in that I worked for a very long time and did well enough financially where I can make those choices now. Now, I remember when I was in my 20s and reading Milton Glaser's 12 Steps on the Road to Hell And he was quite adamant about designers not doing any harm with their work. And I remember thinking at the time, because I loved and adored Milton, he was my mentor, he was my teacher, that it was all well and fine when you have Milton's talent to say that. But if you don't have legendary talent, you sometimes have to compromise. And there were lots of compromises I made that I now regret. Some of the work that I'm doing now, I guess I would consider karma yoga. And that I'm trying to make up for some of the things that I look back on and wish that I hadn't done. But I also know at the time I was doing those types of projects to make payroll.
Yeah. Can you tell us?
Oh, cigarette packaging. But I was also a smoker when I was doing it and didn't have the same beliefs that I do now. But it was primarily that, just cigarette packaging, that I also did give the option of our staff to not do. And so some people did it and some people didn't. But it really helped with payroll at that time in our trajectory. And that was also like good 20 years ago.
Yeah. What happened?
But now I did a project for the Department of Justice where I was working to help them win a case against big tobacco, and they won.
Nice. What have been some of your favorite projects that you've worked on?
Well, my work with Lambda Legal and redesigning their identity was, as I said, a joy. Lambda Legal is a legal organization that helps the LGBTQ plus community as well as people with HIV. And that, again, an absolute joy and an honor. My work with the Joyful Heart Foundation, again, just a joy and an honor. Looking back on my corporate career.
Yeah, you've done so much.
Oh
so
my
I'm
God.
just curious, what was amazing and what, was not.
What was amazing was really more some of the collaboration that I did with other brand consultancies. So I did a collaboration, a joint project with IDEO, which I loved. I did a joint project with Wolf Olins that I loved. So it was really more the people that I enjoyed working with. We commissioned JKR to redo the Masters in Branding identity. And that was amazing. And when they asked me about our creative brief, I said I wanted to be as experimental as possible and win a lot of awards. And it did. And both, they succeeded. Working with them was outstanding. Just an incredible experience. Tosh Hall is a genius.
Awesome. That's awesome. You mentioned creative briefing. What goes into a creative brief that you feel makes it successful for both sides, the client and the design team or the branding team?
An understanding of the strategic reason that you're doing anything. What is the benefit of this redesign? What is the purpose of this redesign? What is the heart and soul of this redesign or this rebranding or this reinvigoration or this repositioning? Everything starts with the positioning. That has to come before the branding. How are we going to view this brand in the marketplace, on shelf, in culture? And how do we communicate that to people in the most genuine way?
Where do you look for inspiration? Like after you have all this information and you're working with yourself or your team, where's your first step to go?
I'm inspired by living, honestly. I mean, it's a question that I get asked a lot, and I have trouble answering it because I don't want to say, well, everything, but I read a tremendous amount. I have a lot of really interesting friends that I'm inspired by. I love traveling. When I hit my 50s, I decided that one of the things that I wanted to do in my life was see as much of the world as possible. So I've been doing that. 2 years ago, my wife and I went to Antarctica, which
Nice.
was, one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. It was almost as if you were going back in time and seeing what the earth looked like before we fucked it up. And even going there was an experience, taking a boat 3 days through Drake Passage, which is where all of the oceans of the world converge. Antarctica is 24 time zones. the scientists there tend to stay on the time zone that they come from. And because we took off from Chile, we were on Chilean time the whole time. Um, but it was unbelievable to see no pollution, crystal clear water, crystal clear skies, the icebergs that are translucent and shimmer, the penguins. We had to, when we left the boat we were on, we had to walk. We were wearing, obviously, we were wearing big boots. We had to walk through a type of water that was a disinfectant. So we wouldn't bring anything into Antarctica that wasn't supposed to be there. All of our clothes were examined. It was really, really amazing. So that's where I find a lot of inspiration, and I make a lot of art about the trips that I take.
Yeah, that is awesome. So when you take on a project, how is it you doing most of the work, or are you working with a team usually?
Oh, I'm almost always working with the team when it's branding. When it's art, then I'm pretty much working on my own. Although, if it's art that then needs to be published, then I'll work with somebody to help me with the technological stuff. As I mentioned, I'm not adept technologically.
Yeah.
Although I'm making most of my art now on an iPad, and I love that. And I'm even doing some experimenting with AI for reference and research. But all of the technological elements I get help with.
What does the team structure typically look like?
Well, it's very different now than it was when I was working in a big agency. In a big agency, you have somebody that's helping to get the projects, then you have somebody that's managing the projects, then you have a group of people that are doing the pre-designed strategy, then you have the people that are doing the design work, and then you have the people that are doing the implementation. So, you can have a project team of 20 people or more.
Mhm.
When I was working on the redesign of Lambda Legal or the redesign of the Joyful Heart Foundation, that was a much smaller team. I would say with Lambda Legal, it was a team of maybe 4 or 5 people. And then we worked with WordPress to do the end, the backlog. Oh, no, that's for Joyful Heart. And then they took it in-house and did a lot of the implementation, although they are working with one of the people from our team that continued to help them with implementation. For Joyful Heart, it was a smaller team as well. I worked with a group of students and alumni from the Masters in Branding program, and then WordPress helped us with the and the backlog website.
Okay, makes sense. Do you typically put the teams together? Or like,
Mhm.
how do these collaborations come about?
Well, if I'm commissioned to do a project, then I'll put a team together. I'll also recommend other
Mhm.
teams if the project is bigger than I can handle or outside the scope of my capabilities. So, for example, I'm in the process now of collaborating with Pentagram on a project that was well out of my talent level. And so I'll be collaborating with them on that, and that's just started. But generally speaking, if it was when I was working in a corporate environment, then I would tend to handpick the people that I thought were most culturally compatible with the project. And now it's mostly my friends.
Yeah. How have you seen branding shift and like your approach to branding over time with the rise of social media?
The rise of social media is just an extension of the brand. And if it isn't, it's not going to work. The biggest change that I've seen, and I talked about this a bit in my TED talk, is how branding has become democratized through technology beginning in about 2010, 2011. And we've seen more change in the last 10 to 15 years than we've seen in the last 10,000, in that people, humans, and I don't want to use the word consumer very intentionally here, are using the very tenets of branding that the corporations appropriated from people a couple of hundred years ago. A couple of thousand years ago, humans were making brands. There's really very little difference between a brand like the Catholic Church and Apple. The brand was created little over 2,000 years ago, the Catholic Church brand, and it has a mark, as does Apple. It has a place of worship, as does Apple with their Apple stores. And it has a cultural resonance that allows people to very specifically convey their affiliations, signify their beliefs just by the sheer virtue of the little white ear pods or a crucifix necklace. And while some people might blanch at the idea that the Catholic Church is a brand, I'm not talking about necessarily a commercial brand. I'm talking about a cultural brand that signifies beliefs. And if you're signifying beliefs through a system, through an identity, through a product, that's a brand. That is a brand. It's manufactured meaning. And anybody that has an awareness of different religions, but might not practice them, will understand that. Because you're viewing an identity and a system of beliefs that may or may not be empirical, depending on who's viewing them, who's believing them. And the same thing goes for a soda brand. You might think one is better than the other. Does the market share convey that, or does personal taste convey that?
Yeah.
You can have a discussion about that for probably 3 weeks, and it would be a super interesting conversation. But a lot of it depends on a person's personal understanding and belief system about that thing, whether it's a banana, whether it's a religion, whether it's a phone, whether it's a pair of sneakers, whether it's a handbag, whether it's a movement. And so what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years is how people are using branding to not signify something that's for profit, but is signifying something that they believe should be changed. They believe should be different. And that hasn't happened in a very, very long time. And that gives me a lot of hope about the discipline in the future.
Do you have an example of a movement brand?
Black Lives Matter, trans rights, I mean, even Occupy Wall Street was a very successful brand for a very long time now. One of the reasons that didn't continue as a big in-your-face movement was because they didn't have a leader, whereas there are a number of leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement. Any brand needs an evangelist. And you can see that whether it be Steve Jobs or Jesus Christ or Phil Knight or Tarana Burke, all of the people that have very strong beliefs that create change in the world, good and bad, have leaders.
Yeah. Why do you think people, I think more than ever, at least I'm seeing, they kind of scoff. They're starting to hate the word brand. They're becoming like, oh, like everything's about building a brand and it's kind of exhausting. Do you think some of that comes from a lack of understanding about like the basic definition of what a brand is?
Yeah, I do. And I also think it's a pendulum. In 2003, I was called a she-devil for my beliefs about branding. And then, in 2019, I get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the same people that criticized me.
Why were they calling you a she-devil exactly?
Because I worked in branding and because I had, at the time, redesigned the Burger King logo, and I'd done some work with Star Wars, and I was creating merchandising for a movie, and people... everything is a pendulum. Everything is a pendulum. It goes back and forth and back and forth.
Is it because they were aligning it with just like you kind of selling out with capitalism?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I try to instill in people, especially like when we have our clients or we're teaching others, aspiring creatives or artists, is that the brand is not evil. And it really is just about...
It's people that are evil.
It is people that are evil.
The brand doesn't exist without a person making it. And that's what I mentioned earlier on in our conversation. It's a process of meaning manufacture. And it's all about positioning and creating a system of beliefs that you then project out into the world. Who's doing that projection? It's not the car. It's not the sneaker. It's a human. People talk about evil corporations. Corporation is evil if the people in it are bad actors.
Yeah.
Just like there are good people and there are bad people. There are brands that try to be good and there are brands that are bad. But the brands that try to be good, it's a slippery slope because if it is a publicly traded brand, the brand manager, the CEO, the board have a fiduciary duty to the shareholder. And that fiduciary duty creates a conundrum because what might be best for the shareholder might not be best for the planet in the grand scheme of things. And then bad decisions are made. And that's also where you see opportunism. That is a very big conundrum for any for-profit brand, which is again why I do admire Nike for making that stance
Yeah.
with Colin, because they were sacrificing potential profit in order to convey a belief.
Do you think it's possible for a brand that is for profit that wants to succeed and become, let's say, $1 billion brand? Is it possible for them to be a good brand?
No, it is not. It's
I
not.
agree. Yeah.
It's not possible.
I think it's inevitable there's going to be trade-offs in that process.
The moment you have to answer to a board, to a consumer, and to Wall Street, there's going to be conflict.
Yeah, and so I think as the founder of a brand, you have to come to terms with that crossroads.
For a $1 billion brand,
Yeah.
for a smaller brand, you can certainly make decisions that are best for your employees, for your audience. But the moment you have to answer to Wall Street, it's just not possible. It's not possible.
Yeah, I agree.
When you are looking for profit above all else, if that is the lead gene, then everything else comes second, including values, including practices, including manufacturing, including shipping.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of go on what the concept of the evangelist, and especially because we are seeing the success, I think, of like these creator-led startups where the founder is very present, making the content very visible, like kind of the face of the company in a strong way. These are the companies that are winning in a lot of ways on the startup level.
Yeah, for the short term.
Okay.
What happens when they die?
Okay,
What
so let's talk
happens
about
when they
that.
retire? Look at all the CEOs that have to come back. Even Steve Jobs had to come back. I know, not from the dead, from being fired. So it's a short-term advantage. But who remembers Mr. Kellogg or Mr. Procter and Mr. Gamble? And, of course, they were all white men.
So do you think that is a good strategy for the founder to be the face?
As it's being established, yes, but you have to put in place a succession plan that allows for continued growth and innovation. Is that Tim Cook? Maybe. Is that Alan Dye instead of Johnny Ive? I would put a good bet on that one. But it remains to be seen.
Yeah. That's definitely how we advise our startup clients too, is like in the beginning, I think I agree with you. It is really necessary for them to, unless they can afford to hire full-time creators who are the face, or they can bring on partners who are the face, for that founder to kind of step in and then, but have a structure in place where they can fade out so the brand can be like that legacy brand.
It depends. I mean, look at Disney. They had to bring Bob Iger back. He isn't Walt Disney, but I don't know. What would Walt Disney think of his company right now?
Yeah, I don't know. But I think that's that's something founders ask me a lot. Like they're like, I don't know if I want to be, and like that's a huge conundrum. So yeah, I was just curious. Like,
I think it really depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the brand. It depends on the goal of the brand. A lot of brands are started without a big time founder. More now because a lot of the most popular brands now are technological brands. But then you run into the problem of, what if we don't believe in their decision? What if they are ultimately people that are bad actors? And one might argue that the mayor of New York City is the evangelist of New York City. Well, what happens when he gets convicted of fraud and bribery, as it's happening right now? Does that damage the brand? Look at what happened with the president from 2016 to 2020. I'm not even going to say his name. I find him so repulsive. And that dilutes the impact of the national brand. Look at what happened with Martha Stewart. Has that brand ever really recovered? I don't know that it has. It's still a great brand in a lot of ways, but it took a huge downturn when she went to prison.
Yeah, definitely.
Look at what happened with Miramax and Harvey Weinstein. So unless somebody is genuinely an evangelist with good intentions, with generous intentions, and in many ways with selfless intentions.
You have said in a previous interview that I saw that when you started your podcast, Design Matters, you really didn't put a lot of thought into your personal brand, or you didn't even have a logo for a long time. And I'm curious why that is.
Well, first of all, I don't believe in personal brands.
Okay.
I have a very, very strong feeling about anyone seeking to be a personal brand. You can own a brand, you can be a brand evangelist, but the moment you say that you're a brand, you're manufacturing your own meaning. Brands, as I said, don't direct themselves. You can own a brand and manage the brand. You can have products, but why would you want to embody the best practices of a brand? Consistency. Humans are messy. We change all the time. Why would we want to aspire to be a fixed moment in time that is in many ways positioned to appeal to a consumer in a certain way?
Yeah.
Humans have a soul. Brands don't have souls. Brands don't have soul. Show me a brand that has a soul. Show me a brand that bleeds. And so once we start to manufacture our meaning in order to appeal to a certain amount of people in a certain way, we cease to be human.
Were you kind of, I don't know, absorbing like the podcast as something deeply personal to you that you didn't want to be branded at the time?
Yes, I started Design Matters in a lot of ways as a Hail Mary to my creativity. I started it almost 20 years ago, February 2005. And at the time I had just come through a pretty serious depression. I graduated college in 1983 and at the time had a lot of aspirations to live a more creative life than I was living at that time. Everything I was doing was about shelf presence and market share. And I just felt that I was losing or maybe had lost my creative spirit. And so when I had this opportunity, when it came to me, I wasn't looking for it, I jumped at the chance to try to do something creative that also felt somewhat adjacent to my business and that I could talk to my clients about creative things. And I didn't end up really talking to many clients about creative things. Mostly it was people that I admired in the sort of more creative fields than I was doing at the time. And because I was working so deeply in the world of branding, kind of wanted the podcast to be unbranded or maybe an anti-brand. And so, of course, it wasn't. I didn't understand as much about branding as I do now, 20 years later. But at the time, it felt better not to have a logo and certainly a website. And this was really before social media. I still don't have a Design Matters Instagram or a Design Matters Twitter. I have a Design Matters Facebook only because somebody made it for me. I did create a logo after Aaron Draplin sort of created a intervention with me on the podcast where he gave me logos because he was distressed that I didn't have one. And then ultimately I created one, but I created one from a piece of art that Christoph Niemann had given me in, I guess, 2001 for.
Mhm.
I'd had that all along, but never pulled it out because I never considered it as something that could be a mark. And that's my little pixelated face.
Yeah, no, I love it actually. I believe it was real estate giant Ryan Serhant who said somewhat recently, everything has a brand. You either control it or you don't.
True. If you don't control your brand, the consumer will control it for you.
Right. So yeah, I was curious if that's I think that is true. I think you put intention, but it can be simple. Like you said, if you want something to be an anti-brand, like that's also kind of a brand in its own
Oh,
way.
absolutely. If it's
Yeah.
if it has a mark, if it has a website, even Adbusters is a brand.
Mhm.
And not only is it a brand, but it sells sneakers, anti-brand sneakers on their website.
Yeah.
So it's a brand. Most of the organizations that are fundamentally against branding use the very tenets of branding that they abhor to create their own anti-brand brand.
Yeah, definitely.
But nothing about branding is simple. I will say that. You said something about simple. Nothing about branding is simple. It's one of the most comprehensive, complicated disciplines in the creative field.
You are, the co-founder and chair, right, of the master's program at School of Visual Arts. Because it's so complicated, how do you kind of distill it down for your students? And like, what does that curriculum look like?
Well, we don't distill it down. I think that we probably overwhelm them with classes. We have so many classes now. I was advised at the very beginning of the program and this was 15 years ago, to have classes just Monday through Thursday and give the kids a break. But we don't. We have classes Monday through Friday every evening. Most of our students are working professionals.
Mhm.
We often have classes, workshops on Saturday. We work them hard, but they're getting a master's degree in 10 and a half months. So I feel obligated to do that. Otherwise, they're not coming out with a degree that is thorough
Mhm.
and robust. But we teach cultural anthropology, we teach behavioral psychology, we teach economics, we teach the business of branding, we teach did I say economics? I don't know if I said it or not. Market research, semiotics, linguistics. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on because branding is so many disciplines coming together. What
Mhm.
we don't actually teach is Photoshop and the sort of technical aspects of creating a brand in the more tactical manner. Ours is practical in that you're learning about technique, but we're not teaching the tactical aspects of making a brand on the computer
Why is that?
because you don't need to have that.
Mhm.
That is something that you can create with technical skills.
The School of YouTube.
Well, no, I mean, they have a lot of undergraduate classes and
Mhm.
continuing education classes that teach that, but we're teaching much more about how to think.
Yeah.
We teach brand thinking, not Photoshop.
Mhm. No, that makes a lot of sense. You've talked about this exercise you have that you learned from Milton, I believe, when you were his student, but it's called your 10-year plan for a remarkable life. What does that entail?
Well, in 2005, again, part of this period where I was trying to reinvigorate my creative spirit, I applied for and got into a class, a summer intensive with Milton Glaser, which was life-changing. And in the class, the final exercise was writing an essay conveying what your life could look like 5 years into the future. Now, the class was the student body was primarily people, mid-level professionals that were looking to reboot their creativity. Most of the students I teach are under 30. At the time I took the class, I was in my 40s. And so it was appropriate to think in 5-year increments. Although, while I did have a lot of things that manifested within 5 years, it took really more like 12 or 15 for everything to manifest.
Yeah.
So you write this essay about your future self. It's not a process essay. I guess you can tell I'm not that much into process. It's really it's an essay about manifesting everything you want in your life without coming up with a way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of a bit of a courageous leap of faith. Assuming this all happens, what would your life look like? Not how do you make it happen, assuming it happens. And I took it very seriously. He suggested that we take it very seriously. He actually said that he'd been doing the exercise for several decades, many decades, and that it was really one of the most powerful things that he taught. So he asked us to be very careful and intentional with writing this essay. And so I did. You know, what Milton said, I did. I wrote a 12-page essay. I made a list of all the things in the essay that I wanted to manifest. And then I put it away. I forgot about it. I didn't put a lot of credence into the magic of this happening. I'm definitely not a woo-woo kind of person. And then about a year later, I was looking for some notes. I had written it in a journal that I had been keeping at that time. And I was looking for an address that I remembered writing in this journal. And so I went looking for it and came upon the 12-page essay and reread it. And I was like, whoa, like certain things had already started manifesting. And so then I took it a little bit more seriously. And then a couple of years later, again, I started to think about the essay, and it was remarkable. These big, audacious goals that I'd had for myself were happening.
Like what?
Like writing a book, like teaching at SVA. I was a student when I did the essay, and now I was a teacher. At the time, I was really, really committed to having a voice within AIGA. And then I was on the board of the New York chapter. And then I ended up being on the board of the national chapter. And then I ended up being president of AIGA in 2009. And that was even bigger than I had envisioned. And so all of these things that started to happen felt like they all were seated in that essay. And so I'm super grateful to Milton for that. Then when he stopped teaching, I asked him if I could teach the exercise in my classes, and he gave me permission to do that. But I evolved it to a 10-year plan. Mm-hmm. Because it really was 10 years before you could really see the fire of what I'd created. I had the embers through then, but the big sort of fire of it really happened between years 10 and 12. And also because my students are younger and I wanted to give them more runway. And the same thing happens. I have students that write me and tell me, oh my God, all of this has happened. Thank you so much. Thank you, Milton. And so it's really carrying on his legacy.
Is it mostly well received by your students? Is everyone excited to do it?
No. Some students are really terrified. What if I write the wrong thing? I can't make choices. And what I tell them is, then don't. Have a day with a lot of meetings. Have a day where you're doing a lot of different things. That's what I did. You're going to a museum to talk about the show you're curating, and you're going to meet your publisher about your book, and you're meeting with a client about a cool project, and you're having awesome sex at the end of the day with your partner. You know, these things are all possible.
Yeah, I love that. It can look like anything. Yeah, a lot of the guests that I've interviewed here on Deepfeed, when I've asked them, I think I started asking a 5-year plan, and most of them were like, I don't think like.
Oh yeah, people say that all the time. I can't think about 10 years from now. Yeah. I can't think of next week.
Yeah,
like, try.
Yeah,
just try.
It's scary, but I do think that exercise would be good for me, actually.
Yeah, that's why I made a deck of cards about it. I had a number of publishers come to me asking if I'd write a book about it, and I didn't want to. And so I made these creative cards that help. Again, I didn't want to write a book because I didn't want there to be a process. Mm-hmm. And so what I did was create a deck of cards, pick the cards in the order you want them, or one side is questions you can answer in any order you want. And the other side are just prompts, just a word, imagine, so that people can do this in any which way they want.
Was doing like a podcast or a creative project in your plan?
I had already started the podcast. Okay. I'd started the podcast in February of 2004, and I took Milton's class in August of 2005. And so, oh no, wait, I'm wrong about that. I started thinking about the podcast in 2004. I started the podcast in February of 2005, hence the upcoming 20th anniversary. Math is not my strong point. And I took Milton's class several months later.
Mm-hmm.
In the 10-year plan was the growth of the podcast, but I wasn't thinking 20 years ahead. I was only thinking 5.
Yeah. When you started it, did you think this is going to be a very long project?
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all. First of all, I had to pay the radio station. It was Voice America, and it's different from Voice of America, which is evil. Voice America approached me about doing a podcast. Again, I was looking for some creative outlet. Thought, this could be fun. I loved the people that worked in my radio station in college. It sort of reminded me of that. I also loved John Corbett's character in, I forget the name of that Alaska show that was on for many years. And he was a DJ and sort of just waxed prophetic in the microphone. And I did that a little bit at the beginning with my monologues, but I just thought it would be a fun exercise. I signed on for 13 episodes. Then I signed on for another. I ended up doing 100 episodes on Voice America and then created it as my own standalone podcast. But I started uploading the show later on in 2005, mostly so that people that couldn't listen to it live could hear it anytime they wanted. But it still had the wonky, crummy commercials in it. And I often say that podcast at that time, or that radio show at that time, was a bit like working with Wayne and Garth on Wayne's World. That's how, I really thought, oh my God, these producers who were in Arizona are just in a basement somewhere bonging. And it was, yeah, it was bad.
What has been your favorite part of doing this podcast?
Learning. I do so much research for the show that I learned so much in the process of doing it. And I live in people's worlds. I deeply immerse myself in their worlds. And it could be a scientist, or it could be a writer, a musician, a performer, a designer, an artist. It's incredible to be in their worlds for the time that I'm doing the research and then get to ask them anything I want.
How have you grown the podcast, been able to sustain it? I'm curious, what your monetization strategy is.
Oh, it's very minor. I, again, don't have a big social media presence. I have a lot of people on Instagram that really love what I post, but that's kind of it. I haven't extended to TikTok, which I know is a mistake. I haven't extended to Threads or Blue Sky. I started posting them on YouTube because somebody showed me how to do it really easily. I don't do it, actually. It's just this system that uploads it. I hire somebody to help me do my social media for Twitter, which is probably a waste of money. I am now part of the TED Audio Collective, and they sell advertising that goes on the show. And I make a little bit of money from that, but some years are better than others. There was a big downturn in advertising over the last couple of years. Some years I do really well, some years I don't. But I have a day job and I have side projects, so I don't expect to make a lot of money with the podcast.
Yeah.
I make some, and I'm grateful for it, but I don't. I'm not like buying houses with it.
Right. Well, I'm curious, kind of looking ahead at what's on the horizon for you. I know you have a book coming out, Love Letter to a Garden, coming out April 2025.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
There are a couple of projects that I can look back on in my life and say they were just pure joy. And this is one of them. I drew, photographed, painted every single word of this book.
Wow.
The only thing that's typeset are some recipes and the copyright page and some endnotes. The whole story is hand-drawn.
Wow.
And photographed, and one piece of art that I made constructing a memory through AI, which was kind of cool. It has nothing to do with branding. It has nothing to do with design, really. It's ostensibly a book about my quest to have a garden, as opposed to a successful garden. Like, nobody's going to take a photo of me in my gorgeous garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a street fight in many ways, to quote Brene Brown, to make this book as a gardener, because I'm not a gardener. I'm well, I mean, Roxanne would say, yes, you're a gardener. So I don't want to say, no, I'm not a gardener. I'm an aspiring gardener.
Mhm.
I'm a gardener that went through decades of not having any sense of what I was doing and failing. I've had several garden spaces in my life. I was very lucky. I've had a lot of outdoor space. I've often just chosen to live on the ground floor of an apartment so that I had have some outdoor space. And I never lived in a big elevator building. I just lived in brownstones in townhomes that had, and I always would try to rent the ground floor for a garden. But I didn't know what I was doing. And so I just had a lot of failure. Then during COVID, I was already engaged to Roxanne, but we weren't living together and we weren't married. But during COVID, right, really at the very beginning of COVID, we decided it would be better for me to go stay with her in her place in LA than my place in New York. I'm a native New Yorker. I actually felt very guilty leaving my city in a time of need, but I wanted to be with Roxanne.
Mhm.
And she wanted to stay there. And so I did. I moved out there. Roxanne said, pack for 2 weeks, because we all thought that, everybody would stay home and we'd be all back in the streets and back to our lives in, a month. But I ended up needing to buy a lot more underwear.
Mhm.
And she has a beautiful backyard, absolutely gorgeous backyard. And so I was like, I'm going to start gardening and seeing what I can do here. And because the weather is so beautiful there,
Yeah.
and because she had this pristine ground, I was able to, for the first time in my life, grow tomatoes and cucumbers and carrots. And it's been amazing. And
Yeah.
so gardeners are not going to learn about gardening in my book. They're going to read and see my quest, my series of failures, and my tiny, tiny little bit of success. It's really it's a visual story about resilience and just continuing to try against all odds, which in many ways is a big theme of my life.
I love that. I'm so excited.
I am too. I really, I have another project that I'm super excited about. And that is a piece of art that I made for NASA,
Oh, wow.
and in collaboration with a group of people from the Caltech's JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, with Dan Goods and Preston Dyke, and a group of David Rager, a group of people that I just had an incredible opportunity. Dan invited me to help create a piece of art for the Europa Clipper, which is launching next month from Cape Canaveral. There's a hope or a thought that under one of Jupiter's moons, under the icy crust of Europa, there might be water. And if there's water, there might be life.
Right.
And so a space probe is launching, I believe, on October 10th, if the weather and all of the sort of various variables are all in place. And it'll take a 4-year journey.
Wow. 4 years.
To Jupiter's moon. And I created a piece of art on the outside of the probe.
That's so cool.
Which is just surreal. And it is a piece of art that contains a lot of symbolism. So we asked 110 people in their native tongue to say the word water. So we have 110 languages represented, some that are no longer in existence. And we converted them to sound waves, double entendre. And I took those sound waves, and you can manipulate a sound wave. You can elongate it, you can widen it, and the integrity is still there. It just might be water or water. And so the integrity of the sound wave is still there. And so I made a piece of art mimicking the Big Bang. There's even a piece of art in it that signifies American Sign Language, which I'm really happy about. And it's on the outside of the panel. So, any extraterrestrials passing by might be like, wow, look at that. Look at those little earthlings and their little attempts to make these things travel. Because obviously, if they're seeing it, then they're way more advanced than we are. And On the inside is a beautiful poem that Ada Limon wrote, our poet laureate. And there's some mathematical equations. And so, yeah, my project's going to space.
That's amazing.
I know.
Congratulations.
I
That's
know.
huge.
It's so surreal.
Oh, amazing. Well, I can't wait to see it, for sure. Are there any other projects that we should be on the lookout for 2025?
I did a really cool calendar with Seth Godin.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's a page-a-day calendar. He's been doing them for years, and they're very popular. And he's a dear friend and a mentor, and he sends out a daily newsletter. So everybody should sign up for it because it's just brilliant. And he's been doing it for years, and he's never missed a day in, I don't know, over a decade. When I signed up for the email, I was really struck by how many of his newsletters, emails were memorable and things that I wanted to keep. And so I made a little folder in my email, and it's SG. And I started to put the emails that he was sending that I wanted to keep and remember into that file. And I don't remember why, but a little over a year ago, he wrote something, and sometimes I like them so much that I'll send them back to him and say, wow, or thank you, or OMG, or LOL. And I sent him one and I said, this is going in the file. And he was like, what file? And I'm like, my SG file of your emails for the past 10 years. And he was like, oh, we should do something with those. And I was like, sure, anything you want. I'll do anything you tell me, Seth. And I didn't really go any further with it because I just thought he was playing with me. And then like a few weeks later, he's like, hey, I do this calendar. Maybe we can include your quotes. Maybe it could be a calendar of your favorite quotes. So you curate it. And I said, okay, can I hand draw all 365? And he's like, really? Do you want to do that? And I was like, yes,
Wow.
thinking this won't be that hard. 3 months later, it's like 365 pieces of art because I wanted it to be special. I didn't want it to just be like scribbled. And so that's out now, but it obviously begins in January.
Wow. That's, I don't know how you did 360. Did you work on that every single day?
Every single day.
Yeah.
For a long time.
Months. That's very impressive. Awesome.
It was that was also just a labor of love.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely link it in the description. Is it available for pre-order?
Yeah. Okay. No. Everyone, it's out. You can get
out.
it. You know, they start selling 2025 calendars in August. So you can get it.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you, Debbie, for coming onto the show.
Thank you,
and
Winter.
Sharing all this with us. And this was really amazing, and it's an honor to have you.
Oh, thank you. It's a lot of fun. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.
And it's been a pleasure. You and your team. You're awesome.